Life is full of unexpected twists. And sometimes the people you trust the most can betray you when you least expect it. This is the story of a widow's battle to protect her husband's legacy from a sister-in-law who would stop at nothing to claim it for herself. From the shock of a funeral to a courtroom showdown, this story is about resilience, justice, and the powerful lessons learned when facing betrayal head-on. Subscribe to our channel to start the story today. It's hard to believe that 2 weeks have passed since David's death. Even as I sit here, still in the black dress I wore to his funeral, it doesn't feel real. Every morning I wake up with the same dull ache in my chest, expecting to hear his voice, complaining about the traffic, asking what's for dinner, or even giving me that tired but soft smile he always gave me after a long day. I can still see him, in my mind's eye, standing in the doorway with his briefcase, looking like he was trying to hold it all together despite the pressure of running a successful business. I can still feel his presence. But then I remember, he's gone. David had been my rock for so many years. My best friend. My partner in everything. We'd built our lives together, side by side. And that's why what happened at his funeral hit me so hard. The service had been a blur of emotions. The quiet sobs from friends, the comforting pats on the back from family, and the quiet hum of people trying to pay their respects. I had never imagined that I would be sitting at the front of the church. Grief so overwhelming that my hands shook. They were clasped together so tightly that my nails left crescent-shaped indentations on my palms. I couldn't bring myself to look up. All I could think about was how we hadn't even had the chance to say goodbye properly. Then there was Jessica. She sat there, arms crossed, her expression colder than the church itself. She had always been a distant presence in our lives. My sister-in-law. But today, she was more than that. She was almost detached. While everyone else seemed to be drowning in grief, Jessica's eyes flicked around the room, scanning the people around her, looking as though she was completely uninterested. I couldn't help but feel a small pang of discomfort. I knew something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The funeral was already enough of a nightmare, and I was too exhausted to even consider what Jessica might be plotting. The eulogies had just ended, and the time had come to move to the burial site. My body felt like lead. I was barely holding on to my composure, still in disbelief that David was really gone. But that's when it happened. She stood up. The way Jessica cleared her throat so loudly, so deliberately, was enough to make my stomach drop. The moment she stood, every eye in the room turned to her. I could feel my heartbeat quicken. Something about the way she moved felt off, like she was preparing for something big. I tried to stay focused on breathing, but I couldn't ignore her words. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice echoing throughout the church. She had the attention of everyone in that room. Family, friends, business associates, they were all now watching her. Waiting. I could already see the uncomfortable expressions on some of David's employees. They knew her, and they knew how she could be. But no one, not even in my worst nightmares, could have predicted what she would say next. With a sharp turn of her gaze, Jessica looked directly at me. Her lips were pressed together in a tight, almost grim line. "I deserve his business more than you," she declared, her words laced with a sense of entitlement that made my stomach churn. I remember feeling like the air had been knocked out of me. I could feel my hands begin to shake. But it wasn't just from grief anymore. It was from rage, too. She had the audacity to say that. To stand there, at my husband's funeral, and claim that she deserved what he had built with his blood, sweat, and tears. "You have no idea how to run it," she continued, and I refused to let my brother's hard work go to waste. Her words were so sharp, so cruel, that for a moment, I couldn't even respond. My chest was tight, my heart pounding so loudly I could hardly hear anything else. The church was silent, except for the gasps of disbelief that rippled through the crowd. I'm sure people had begun to whisper among themselves. But all I could focus on was the fury bubbling inside me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to confront her right then and there. But I knew I had to stay composed. Not for me, but for David. This wasn't just about me. This was about his legacy. About what he had built. Not just for us, but for all the employees and partners he had worked so hard for over the years. For a moment, I was frozen. Then, with every ounce of strength I had left, I slowly stood up. I wiped the tears from my face, trying to force a calmness I didn't feel. My hands were still trembling, but I couldn't let her see how much her words were affecting me. "That's funny," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I took a deep breath before adding, "Because I have a surprise for you." Jessica's eyes narrowed. She was clearly confused, probably thinking I was just trying to avoid the confrontation. She leaned in, her posture aggressive. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. I didn't respond. I simply turned to the lawyer, who was sitting a few rows back. David's lawyer. The man who had worked with us when David's health began to deteriorate. The man who knew exactly what David had wanted. I motioned for him to stand. He adjusted his glasses and calmly stood up, taking a thick envelope from his briefcase. "This," he said, his voice firm and calm, "is David's final will and testament." I could see Jessica's face begin to drain of color. Her eyes were wide, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. "And Jessica," the lawyer continued, "you might want to sit down." I didn't think I'd ever forget the look on her face as the lawyer began reading the will aloud. It was a moment of pure devastation for her. A moment that she couldn't have predicted. As the lawyer's steady voice filled the room, I could see Jessica's body begin to tremble. I didn't feel sorry for her. Not for a second. She had made her own bed. And now she was going to have to lie in it. But what followed next would change everything. The lawyer's voice cut through the tension in the room. And with each word he spoke, the weight of David's decision became clearer. As the will unfolded, I watched Jessica's face drain of color. The blood drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a ghost. She had no idea what was coming. And in that moment, I could feel the entire room's collective breath held as we all watched her unravel. "To my beloved wife," the lawyer read, his voice steady and unwavering. "I leave our home, our shared assets, and full ownership of my company, Jacobson Enterprises. She has been my partner in every sense of the word, and I trust her to uphold the values I built this business upon." I glanced at Jessica. She was gripping the edge of the pew so tightly that her knuckles were turning white. I could see the panic setting in. Her jaw clenched as she struggled to absorb the truth. Her eyes darted between the lawyer, the document, and me, her expression twisted with disbelief. She had thought she had it all figured out. She'd come to the funeral, made her grand declaration, and expected to claim David's legacy for herself. She had no idea that David had already made his choice. But the lawyer wasn't done. He paused for a moment before continuing. And when he did, the final blow landed. Furthermore, the lawyer read, "I leave nothing to my sister, Jessica Jacobson, as I have provided for her enough during my lifetime. She has made it clear that she does not respect my choices. And I trust my wife to do what is best for the company moving forward." The room was still for a moment. The silence was thick, heavy with the weight of what had just been revealed. I could hear Jessica's breath come in sharp, quick gasps, her face a mixture of disbelief and rage. Her whole body shook with emotion. And for the first time in the entire ordeal, I felt a surge of satisfaction. This was justice. David had made his choice. And Jessica wasn't going to walk away with anything. Jessica's reaction was immediate. She shot up from her seat, as if the weight of the will had physically struck her. "What?" she screamed, her voice cracking with raw disbelief. "This can't be right. No, this isn't true." The anger in her voice made the room bristle with discomfort. Some of David's longtime employees exchanged uneasy glances. But no one spoke up. Everyone knew how she was. How she'd always seen the world as something that should cater to her. No one was surprised. Yet no one could have predicted how low she would sink. As she stormed forward, looking like she was about to rip the will from the lawyer's hands. I stood my ground. I was done with her antics. I had watched her tear at the fabric of our lives for far too long. She had shown no respect for David, no respect for me, and certainly no respect for what he had built with his blood. sweat, and tears. Actually, I said, my voice cold. He did do this. David made this decision because he knew exactly who you were. You never cared about him. You only cared about what he could give you. Her eyes burned with rage. And she opened her mouth to yell at me. But I cut her off. Where were you when he was sick? Jessica? Where were you when he needed family? The words hung in the air. And for a moment, it felt like the entire room held its breath. The silence was deafening. Jessica's face twisted in fury. But she was speechless. The truth had hit her like a freight train. And she had no response. It didn't take long for her to snap. This is bullshit, she screamed. Her face turning red. I deserve that company. I was his sister. His blood. I could feel the anger in my chest rise again. But I kept it together. No, you don't, I said firmly, my voice cutting through her hysteria. You're nothing but a leech. And you'll never take what's mine. Jessica's hands balled into fists. Her breath coming in sharp. Furious bursts. She looked around, her eyes wide, like she was expecting someone to come to her defense. But there was no one. Not a single person moved. No one stepped forward to support her. She was alone. It was then that she turned and stormed out of the room, nearly knocking over an elderly woman on her way out. The doors slammed behind her with a finality that sent a chill down my spine. It was over, at least. That's what I thought. I looked around at the people in the room, each of them quietly processing what had just unfolded. I could feel the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders. David's final wishes had been made clear. I had to keep going. I had to keep running the business. I had to honor his memory. But little did I know, Jessica wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The worst was yet to come. It didn't take long for Jessica to show her true colors again. I thought, after she stormed out of the funeral, that she'd lick her wounds and slink away. I believed that once she realized David's decision was final, she'd accept it and move on. But I couldn't have been more wrong. 2 days after the funeral, my phone rang late in the afternoon. It was one of David's closest business partners, Alan, his voice filled with urgency and concern. You need to watch your back, Alan warned, his tone low. Jessica's been making calls. She's telling people the will was forged. She's trying to turn them against you. I felt my stomach drop. What do you mean? She's claiming it's not real? Alan sighed heavily. Yes, she's desperate. And she's not giving up. She's reaching out to the board of directors, trying to get them to back her. She's trying to paint you as someone who can't run the business. The anger that surged through me was cold. But it also solidified something deep inside me. I wasn't going to let Jessica ruin everything David and I had worked for. I couldn't let her win. Over the next few days, I tried to remain calm, focusing on the company and keeping everything afloat. But I couldn't ignore the growing whispers. Jessica was relentless. I began to receive messages from employees and former colleagues of David's, all telling me the same thing. Jessica was trying to make people doubt my ability to lead. I tried to stay professional, but I couldn't help but feel the sting of betrayal. I had been with David through thick and thin, building Jacobson Enterprises from the ground up. And now, Jessica, with her reckless ambition, was trying to tear it all down. All because she felt entitled to something that wasn't hers. But it wasn't just rumors. Jessica's actions became more calculated, more malicious. She went to the board of directors, trying to convince them I was incapable of running the company. She even went so far as to spread rumors that I had forced David to sign the will when he was too weak to think clearly. Her accusations were so far-fetched that I didn't even know how to respond at first. It was like she had concocted an entirely different version of reality. One where she was the victim and I was the villain. But the worst part came when I received a call late one evening from the company's head of security. She's here, the guard said, his voice tight with fear. We caught her on camera. She broke into David's office. I could barely process the words. My mind raced as I tried to understand what Jessica was doing. What? How? She had a key, the guard continued. She's gone through some of David's private files. We've already contacted the police. They'll be here soon. I barely heard him. All I could think about was the fact that Jessica had crossed a line. She had broken into the very office that David had spent years working in. The office where so many decisions were made. She had no respect for him, for me, or for the business. By the time I arrived at the office, the police were already there. The security footage was being reviewed, and Jessica was standing in the middle of the office, surrounded by shredded papers. Her hair was wild, and her face was twisted in desperation. She didn't even look like herself. She looked like a person on the edge. Someone who had lost touch with reality. As soon as she saw me, she went wild. "This should have been mine," she screamed. Her voice raw and frantic. It was all supposed to be mine. I stood there in the doorway, watching her unravel. The police officers moved quickly to restrain her as she flailed against them. But what struck me the most wasn't her rage. It was the sheer desperation in her eyes. She wasn't just fighting for the company anymore. She was fighting to hold on to a version of herself that had long since vanished. "Jessica," I said, my voice steady despite the shock of the situation. "You've crossed a line. You're done." She froze, her eyes widening with realization. She didn't even have a chance to react before the officer stepped forward and read her rights. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice firm, "you're under arrest for breaking and entering, theft, and destruction of property." It was over. Just like that. She had taken it too far. And now the consequences were unavoidable. As they led her out of the office in handcuffs, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. It wasn't victory. Not yet. But it was one step closer to justice. And while I watched Jessica being driven away, part of me wondered how far she would go to continue her crusade. People like her don't give up easily. And I had a feeling she wasn't done yet. But I also knew that whatever came next, I was ready. She had underestimated me, just like she had underestimated David. And I wouldn't let her destroy everything we had worked so hard to build. As the weeks passed after Jessica's arrest, the weight of everything finally started to lift. I had spent countless sleepless nights worrying, trying to hold the company together while dealing with the aftermath of everything Jessica had done. But now, as I sat in David's office, my office now, I suppose, I could finally breathe. David had built something incredible, and I was determined to keep it alive, to honor his legacy. The trial came 6 months later. Jessica had hired the best lawyers money could buy, and she tried every trick in the book to worm her way out of the charges. She swore up and down that I had set her up, that I was the villain. But the evidence was irrefutable. The bank records showed she had stolen money. The security footage proved she had broken into the office. And the emails she sent to the IRS showed her attempts to frame me for financial crimes. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, it felt like the world had shifted. Jessica was found guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison. It wasn't just justice, it was closure. I walked out of that courtroom, standing tall, knowing that I had done right by David. The company began to thrive again. Employees who had once feared Jessica's influence came to me with gratitude, knowing they were in safe hands. And though I still missed David every day, I knew I was doing what he would have wanted. As for Jessica, she tried to appeal her sentence, but the evidence was too strong. The court ordered her to pay back everything she had stolen, and everything she had once cherished was stripped away. I can only hope that one day, she'll understand the cost of her actions. As for me, I finally feel at peace. I've carried David's legacy forward, and I've learned the most valuable lesson of all. Never let anyone take what you've earned. Subscribe to our channel to follow more life stories.